History Secrets.
There's something deeply wrong happening in the world. And you may already be feeling it. Even if you can't quite explain it, the numbers don't lie, but the way they are presented almost always hides what truly matters. For nearly 200 years, a nation grew with relative stability. Debt existed, but it was manageable. It was part of the game. Then, something changed. Almost imperceptibly at first, and then explosively, debt began to grow without stopping. Today, it hasn't just increased. It has completely spiraled out of control. We are talking about tens of trillions of dollars accumulated by a single government. And that is only the surface. Because behind this public debt, there is another even more unsettling layer. Ordinary people are also in debt. Credit cards, loans, mortgages. When you add everything up, the total is equally colossal. And the inevitable question arises, almost like an uncomfortable whisper. Who, in fact, is going to pay this bill? The answer may be more disturbing than it seems, because in many cases, this debt will simply never be paid. It will be pushed forward, diluted, redistributed, until it disappears in the form of inflation, loss of purchasing power, and a silent deterioration of quality of life. And this is just one of the signs. In parallel, something more subtle, and perhaps more dangerous, begins to happen. The middle class, historically the pillar of stability in any society, starts to disappear. Not abruptly, but like a constant erosion. Small losses, accumulated over time, until the entire structure becomes fragile. At the same time, another phenomenon emerges. People simply stop having children. Not because of a lack of biological capacity, but because of a lack of perspective. The future no longer feels like a safe place to invest a new life. And when a society stops reproducing, it doesn't just age. It enters a silent process of contraction. This pattern is not isolated. It repeats itself across various countries in the so-called Western world. Housing prices rise to inaccessible levels. Inflation slowly erodes daily life. Economic growth seems to exist only on charts, while concrete reality becomes more difficult. Inequality increases, not just as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience. Some people accumulate assets, others accumulate debt. And in the middle of all this, the system continues to function, at least on the surface. But when a system keeps operating, even when its foundations are deteriorating, it raises an inevitable question. Are we facing a failure or a design? This question opens the door to multiple interpretations. One of the most well-known explanations is so-called neoliberalism. The idea that everything should be guided by economic growth though. If the economy grows, everything gets resolved. If the numbers are positive, the system is healthy. But this logic assumes something fundamental. That economic growth automatically translates into collective well-being. And that does not always happen. Another interpretation points to the rise of large technological corporations. An unprecedented concentration of power. Companies that not only dominate markets, but influence behaviors, decisions, and even perceptions of reality. Within this perspective, a more unsettling hypothesis emerges. What if the objective is not just growth, but control? Because when you don't own a house, don't own assets, and depend entirely on external systems to survive, your margin of autonomy shrinks drastically. There is also the idea of a global reorganization. A more centralized system, where borders lose importance and decisions begin to be made at supranational levels. And, in parallel, even more controversial theories appear, such as population replacement. The hypothesis that certain populations are being gradually replaced by others, considered easier to manage. These ideas circulate, gain traction in certain groups, and are rejected in others. And it is important to maintain a clear distinction. They are interpretations, not necessarily facts. But perhaps there is a more direct and less ideological way to analyze all of this. Whenever you observe a large-scale structural change, there is a question that can brutally simplify the analysis. Who benefits? This question cuts through layers of discourse and goes straight to the point, because systems, in the end, tend to favor certain groups. If housing prices are constantly rising, someone is benefiting from it. If the financial market grows while real income stagnates, there is a group being favored. And when you start connecting these points, a pattern begins to emerge. It is not immediate, it is not obvious, but gradually, it becomes hard to ignore. There is a specific group that seems to be in an extremely favorable position within these transformations. A group that benefits from asset appreciation. That does not depend directly on the growth of productive labor. That is not affected in the same way by inflation in everyday life. And that at the same time holds significant political and economic influence. From this point on, the analysis stops being purely economic and becomes structural. Because perhaps what we are observing is not just a crisis. Perhaps it is a silent reorganization. There is a detail that completely changes how you interpret all of this, and it is almost never discussed directly. We are not dealing only with economics. We are not dealing only with politics. We are dealing with a structural shift in the very composition of society. Never, in all of human history, has there been such a large number of elderly people, and more importantly, such a large number of elderly people with accumulated wealth. This is not a trivial phenomenon. It completely alters the balance of power within a system, because, unlike other times, these people have not only lived longer, they have accumulated assets over decades. Real estate, stocks, funds, properties, and these assets continue to appreciate. At the same time, younger generations enter the system in a completely different position. More indebted, with less access to assets, and facing much higher living costs. This creates an asymmetry. And this asymmetry, when combined with the demographic factor, begins to produce consequences that go far beyond economics. Because, in any democratic society, those who have more presence have more influence. And when you have a growing population of elderly people, with high political participation, high levels of wealth, and a strong interest in maintaining stability, you begin to shape collective decisions based on those interests. From this point on, many of the trends that seem disconnected begin to make sense. High housing prices stop being a problem, and become an advantage for those who already own property. Inflated financial markets stop being a worrying bubble, and become a continuous source of appreciation for those who are already inside. Inflation, in many cases, does not affect in the same way those who have already accumulated enough wealth to absorb these variations. But there is an even more delicate element: the retirement system. For decades, these systems were built on two fundamental assumptions. The first, people would retire and live only a few years after that. The second, investments would grow in a relatively predictable way over time. Neither of these assumptions holds anymore. People are not dying at the expected rate. They are living longer, much longer, and financial markets are not stable. They fluctuate. They rise, fall, generate gains, and losses. This creates enormous pressure on pension funds, because in simple terms, there are more people withdrawing money than people putting money into the system. This is the kind of problem that does not appear immediately. It grows slowly, almost invisibly, until it reaches a critical point, and when that point arrives, there is no smooth adjustment. There is rupture. At the same time, another imbalance emerges. The ratio between workers and retirees begins to invert. For a long time, the system worked under a simple logic, many workers supporting a smaller number of retirees. But now, that ratio is changing. Fewer workers, more retirees. And this is not just a statistical detail, it completely redefines the sustainability of the system. Because, ultimately, someone has to produce. someone has to generate real wealth. And when the productive base shrinks while the demand for resources increases, tension becomes inevitable. This is the point where the analysis stops being comfortable, because it is no longer just about numbers. It is about conflict of interests. On one side, a generation that accumulated wealth, lives longer, and wants to preserve its benefits. On the other, a generation that enters the system with fewer resources, more debt, and fewer prospects. And when these interests collide, the system needs to make decisions. Not always explicit, not always declared, but decisions that, in practice, favor one side more than the other. This is the moment when a concept emerges that, although rarely discussed, explains much of what we are seeing. Gerontocracy. A system where power, political, economic, and institutional, is concentrated in the hands of older individuals. This does not necessarily mean that these individuals are incompetent, nor that they lack merit, but it does mean that their priorities are different. And priorities shape decisions. Young people tend to seek change, experimentation, transformation. Adults tend to seek balance, controlled growth, progressive stability. But the elderly tend to seek security. And security, when taken to the extreme, turns into resistance to change. This explains why entire systems begin to become more rigid, slower, more resistant to any kind of structural transformation, because any change represents risk. And risk, for those who have already accumulated a lot, is something to be avoided at any cost. This starts to reflect in public policies, in economic decisions, and even in the way society deals with individual freedom. Because, in an environment where the priority is security, control becomes a legitimate tool. More surveillance, more regulation, more interference in everyday life. Not always in an aggressive way, often in a gradual way, almost imperceptible, but constant. And when you observe this pattern over time, you realize that it is not about isolated events. It is about a direction. A direction that, slowly, reshapes how society functions. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question is not whether this is happening, but how far this can go. If you take this logic to its ultimate consequences, something starts to become clear, and it is not comfortable. When a society becomes dominated by a structure focused almost exclusively on security, stability, and preservation of wealth, collective behavior begins to change, and not in a subtle way. The first transformation happens in freedom, not necessarily through explicit repression, but through small concessions, seemingly reasonable adjustments, measures justified by protection, health, order, or well-being. Each one of them, in isolation, seems acceptable, but the whole tells another story. Surveillance increases. Technologies that were once tools begin to become mechanisms of constant monitoring. What you do, where you go, who you talk to, what you consume. Everything can be recorded, everything can be analyzed, and eventually, everything can be controlled. But this control does not come with the appearance of oppression. It comes with the appearance of convenience, more security, more practicality, more efficiency. And this is the point where most people fail to realize what is happening. Because when control presents itself as a benefit, it does not encounter resistance. It is accepted. It is integrated. It becomes part of everyday life. And, by the time you realize it, you are already inside a system where leaving it is no longer a simple choice. Another element begins to emerge strongly: financial control. Cash has always represented a form of autonomy, a way to carry out transactions outside centralized systems, a margin of freedom. But this begins to change. The full digitalization of transactions creates an environment where every financial movement can be tracked, analyzed, and, if necessary, limited. It is not just about knowing what you buy, but about being able to decide what you are allowed to buy. This is a type of power that is extremely subtle and extremely powerful, because it does not need to stop you directly. It simply redefines the limits within which you can act, and within those limits you still believe you are choosing freely. Another point begins to emerge within this scenario: the reorganization of the workforce. If there's an aging population with a high concentration of wealth and a growing need for services, then a specific demand arises. Caregivers, nurses, operational workers, people willing to perform tasks that are often undervalued, but essential. And if the local population does not want or cannot take on these roles, the solution becomes almost automatic: import labor. This leads to a significant increase in immigration, not necessarily for humanitarian reasons, but for structural necessity. The system needs young people. It needs workers. It needs support. And this creates a complex dynamic, because at the same time it solves an immediate problem, it also generates social, cultural, and economic tensions. But within the logic of the system, this is secondary. The main objective is to keep the structure functioning, and any measure that contributes to that tends to be adopted. Even if the side effects are significant, there is also a more delicate aspect: the relationship with direct social control. When the highest priority is security, any behavior considered outside the norm begins to be seen as a risk, and risks need to be controlled. This can translate into more laws, more regulations, more state presence in areas that were once private, not necessarily with violence, but with constant authority. Everyday life begins to be shaped by increasingly detailed rules. What can be said, what can be done, how you should behave, and, little by little, the margin of spontaneity shrinks. Not all at once, but progressively, until the very idea of freedom begins to be reinterpreted. Freedom ceases to be the absence of control, and begins to be defined as conformity within a safe system. And this shift is profound, because it does not only change behaviors, it changes perceptions, it changes values, it changes the way people understand the world. And perhaps the most unsettling point is this: this process does not require a centralized plan. It does not require a coordinated conspiracy. It can emerge naturally, from the right incentives, from dominant priorities, from the demographic structure. When you combine population, aging, concentration of wealth, pressure on pension systems, need for stability, and fear of loss, the result tends to follow a predictable direction: more control, more rigidity, more preservation, less change. And this leads us to an inevitable question: if this system continues evolving in this direction, what happens to the next generations? If there is a point where all of this converges, it is here. The future is not just being postponed, it is being redistributed. Every decision made today, economic, political, or social, does not affect everyone in the same way. Some consequences are immediate, others are pushed forward, and almost always, those who pay the highest price still do not have enough power to prevent it. Younger generations enter a system where the assets have already been acquired, where prices have already risen, where opportunities have already been partially captured. They do not start from zero. They start at a disadvantage, with more debt, with more competition, with less margin for error. And at the same time, these same generations are the ones who need to sustain the entire structure: work, produce, pay taxes, finance systems that, possibly, will not be available to them in the future. This is the kind of misalignment that does not explode immediately. It accumulates, silently, until it begins to appear in forms that seem disconnected. Demotivation, anxiety, lack of perspective, refusal to follow the traditional path. Fewer marriages, fewer children, less commitment to long-term structures. Because at some level, there's an intuitive perception that the social contract has been altered. Not officially, but in practice. The implicit promise that effort leads to stability begins to unravel. And when that promise loses credibility, collective behavior changes. People start playing a different game, a shorter game, more immediate, less based on long-term building, and more based on survival in the present. This is not necessarily a conscious choice. It is an adaptation. At the same time, the system continues to demand commitment, discipline, productivity, but offers less and less real security in return. And this tension begins to grow. There is also a deeper and less visible consequence: the change in the relationship with the very meaning of life. When the future no longer seems promising, the present becomes heavy. When effort does not guarantee return, motivation weakens. And when the structure loses coherence, the individual begins to disconnect from it. This creates a kind of emptiness, not necessarily material, but existential, a diffuse feeling that something is not right, even when everything seems functional on the surface. And this type of emptiness cannot be solved only with economic policies. It requires something deeper. But the system, focused on stability and control, rarely addresses this dimension. So, what happens? People begin to search for alternatives, new ways of living, new ways of working, new ways of relating to the world. Some of these alternatives are constructive, others are destructive. But all of them share a common origin: the attempt to recover some degree of autonomy. Because, in the end, that is what is being gradually reduced. Autonomy, real capacity of choice, the ability to build something of your own without completely depending on external structures. And when this capacity decreases, the reaction is not uniform. Some adapt, some resist, some simply disconnect. But the system keeps advancing. The structural logic does not stop. It does not wait for consensus. It does not ask for permission. It follows the incentives. And the incentives, at this moment, point toward the continuation of this model. More concentration, more control, more dependence, less margin for deviation. And this brings us to the final point of this analysis, not as a definitive conclusion, but as an inevitable reflection. If all of this is not the result of a single cause, if there is no single responsible agent, if it is just the natural consequence of multiple factors combining, then the question changes completely. It is no longer, who is doing this? But rather, why is no one stopping it? And perhaps the answer is the most uncomfortable of all, because to stop it, it would be necessary to change the system. And changing the system means threatening exactly those who benefit the most from it. And when those who hold power have no incentive to change, change does not happen. At least, not gradually. There is a point where all these lines of analysis intersect, and it is not in the data, nor in the theories. It is in the consequence. Because regardless of the cause, whether incompetence, economic incentives, demographic structure, or simple inertia, the result begins to manifest in a concrete way. And results cannot be ignored forever. Systems do not collapse suddenly. They wear down. They become less efficient, less responsive, heavier, slower, until, at some point, they stop functioning as expected. And when that happens, there are only two possible paths: adaptation or Rupture. Adaptation requires awareness. It requires recognizing the problem. It requires willingness to change deeply rooted structures. But this type of change rarely comes from those who are comfortable. Rupture, on the other hand, does not require planning. It happens when accumulated pressure exceeds the system's capacity to sustain itself. And when that occurs, it is not controlled. It is not predictable. It is not smooth. The question, then, is no longer whether the system is fair or unfair. It becomes, is it sustainable? Because a system can function for a long time, even while being imperfect. But no system functions indefinitely when its own foundations are being eroded. And perhaps the clearest sign of this is not in charts, nor in policies, but in people's behavior, in the loss of trust, in the reduction of engagement, in the growing feeling that the game is already decided, before it even begins. This is the kind of perception that does not appear in reports, but that, when it spreads, completely changes the dynamics of a society, because systems depend on participation. They depend on belief. They depend on collective acceptance. And when that acceptance begins to weaken, the system continues to exist, but it loses legitimacy. And a system without legitimacy can continue operating for a while, but not indefinitely. It is at this point that the analysis needs to stop looking only at structures and start looking at choices. Not only the choices of governments, but individual choices. How do you respond to this scenario? Do you ignore it? Do you adapt? Do you try to exit the game? Or do you try to understand it deeply in order to act more consciously within it? There is no single answer, because each position within the system offers different possibilities. But there is one constant. Ignoring it does not prevent the system from continuing to evolve. And perhaps, this is the most important reflection. You may not control the system, but you can choose how to position yourself within it. You can choose what to build. You can choose what to believe. You can choose how far to comply and how far to resist. And in a scenario where structures are becoming increasingly rigid, this may be the only real form of freedom that still remains. Because, in the end, the question was never only about economics. It was never only about politics. It was never only about generations. It is about direction, about where all of this is leading, and about how much time is still left before that direction becomes irreversible. Perhaps there is no definitive answer, but there is something that can no longer be ignored. Something has changed, and it continues to change, silently, constantly, and now, inevitably. This was just one of the many enigmas that have crossed the centuries. Around the world, there are lost cities, indecipherable manuscripts, and historical events that still challenge our understanding. Some of these mysteries have begun to be revealed. Others remain completely unexplained. And in the next documentary, we will explore one of these enigmas that continues to intrigue historians to this day. Because when it comes to the history of humanity, there is always a new secret waiting to be discovered. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.